Three, two, one. Okay.
Welcome, dear friends from Círculo Lovecraftiano y Horror Mexico. This is an enormous pleasure to have you all here again in a new edition from the Mouth of the Madman live edition. Due to this new normality, we have changed to these online events with our guests. And I must say, despite that some folk feel caged, feel prisoner, this has given us the opportunity to meet people that we admire and otherwise would be very difficult. And that's the case today. We have the pleasure, the honor of having an amazing author we all admire and whose work has been discussed in our events. And I'm talking about Mr. Laird Barron, a poet, novelist, short story writer whose work has been awarded in several contests, several festivals. And he is a very extremely important for new horror literature. Welcome, Mr. Laird Barron.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, so it's the first time you're talking live with Latin American crew?
Yes, actually. This is the first time, so this is really exciting.
Very cool. So we are gonna start with telling you, last night we discussed two of your previous works. Well, first of all, a few weeks back, we discussed the Men from Porlock. It's an amazing, how was the inspiration for that? I mean, we know you are a wild child, a guy from the forests. What was this? It sounds like a nightmare.
So what was the inspiration? My father was a logger at one time in the 70s when I was very young. And so I obviously had that. But some of the inspiration came from when I lived in Olympia, Washington, which is the capital of Washington State. And I lived in the countryside. It's a small town anyway, but I think about 40,000 people, something like that. But I lived in the countryside, and there are a lot of huge trees there, and a lot of wild terrain outside of the towns and cities. And one afternoon I had been hiking, had been exploring the region, but one afternoon I was sitting at a restaurant, and they had a lot of photographs, black and white photographs from the turn of the 19th century, right around there, up until like into the early 20s. And they were men out in the wilderness, logging with hand saws and mules and steam, and the only mechanized equipment that I saw were like steam engines that were dragging things. And it just really struck me as something that I should start reading about, and maybe set a story back in the 1920s about some loggers, and that's what happened.
Did you have to do some kind of research? Because I mean, all the things you're talking about in this tale, you cover from the railroad works, from the way they live in this barracks, in this. How did you do that, or it was just passed to you by your dad?
Oh no, because my father, was in the 1970s, and so it was pretty rugged, but pretty modernized, comparatively. The time period, I had really very little knowledge of the logging methods from back then, but I did understand a little bit about how everybody lived back then. So it's kind of a combination of things, having grown up in the wilderness and, understanding what it's like to live without electricity, for example, or very limited access. We had a generator, but it was oil lamps and wood burning stoves. And my dad had a chainsaw, but we used a actual double bit axe to do a lot of work. We chopped holes in the lake or in the river to get water with an axe. So I kind of had some experience with roughing it, but for the nitty gritty stuff, I actually did a lot of reading before I wrote the story. It's the same thing with all my historical stuff, and it's it's kind of daunting because you're always going to get things wrong. You're always worried about stuff that you're going to get wrong, no matter how much work you did. And you read, at least I do, and I think this is pretty typical of people who are trying to do a good job writing something in a historical setting. You don't use a lot of what you research. You research many times more, much more on the topic than you can actually ever express in the story. At least, a story like Men from Porlock isn't about logging. That's just the setting. So I did a lot of research for it. I used very little of it in the story, but you'll never know. But I spent weeks and weeks reading specifically about logging and logging in the Pacific Northwest from about 1885, 1890 until about 1930.
And did you consider yourself to be a tough guy back then? Was your father tough with you kids? Like, hey, go out there and chop off that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
it was like that.
To the second part, the tough, because people talk about my characters and they say your characters are very tough, and that's true. So some of the characters are archetypes, secret agents, or in my novel, the Coleridge novels, he was an enforcer for the mafia. He was he shot people. And so I've written about people like that, and definitely those are tough people. But like the men from Porlock they're just loggers. And compared to me, for example, they're tough, very tough people, but they're not, I don't consider them tough. And I don't think that we were particularly tough. It's just that we lived a very unusual lifestyle. So in comparison to the average U.S. citizen, sure, our life back then was very rough, and we were probably very self-reliant and maybe kind of tough to be able to do it. We're very determined, but I wouldn't consider us tough guys. My father, maybe on the border. My father was a Marine, and he fought in the Vietnam War. He was actually in the jungle, and so maybe he's a tough guy, but I don't think that I am or was. And my father definitely expected us to work a lot. I will say that I spent many hours a day outside chopping wood, dragging, running sled dogs, you name it.
Recently, they just released a new movie on Netflix. The Devil All the Time is the name.
Yes.
Did you watch it?
I haven't seen it, but I really like the author, Pollock, Donald Ray Pollock. A super, super good writer. And I love his short fiction. I highly recommend, if you guys like The Devil All the Time, you should try, if you haven't, you should try Knock 'em Stiff, which is a collection. Knock 'em Stiff. It's a collection of short stories. And he's one of our great, I consider him and Stephen Graham Jones and John Langan, whom you guys had on the show not too long ago, some of our great, writers. And I'm looking forward to the show, but I just haven't had a chance.
Correct. Anyone from the guys of the crew wants to ask something that we are just warming up before you forget, Ernesto?
Hi, I would like to know what are you working on right now? What are you writing? Tell us a little about what are you doing right now?
Well, I'm working on several projects. For the last few years, I have been working on the Isaiah Coleridge novels, which are crime, kind of a combination mystery novels about a character. It's a series. But what that's meant is I haven't been able to concentrate on short fiction, which of course is what I'm known for. I did last few years. I have published some short fiction, horror. I haven't gotten away from writing horror, but I just haven't. Normally I write anywhere from 3 to 6, 7 stories a year, and I've been writing like 1 or 2 a year since 2016, 2017. So right now I'm working very hard on. I figured 2020 would be a good year to try to catch up on writing a few short stories, because I would like to get enough together that I like. So I can so I can try to publish a collection, another collection in a year or two. I'm hoping to maybe be done putting together a collection by this time next year, and then send it out and see what happens. So I'm working on short fiction. It's funny though, you were talking about some translation work you did on one of my or translated one of my stories, the Carrion Gods and Their Heaven. And I'm actually, just for my on the side, I'm actually adapting that into a screenplay. So we'll see what happens there. I don't have any, I haven't shown it to anyone. I'm not talking to anybody about it, but it is funny you brought it up, because it's been requested for translation several times the last couple of years, and which kind of surprised me, because it's just one of a bunch of stories. So, but because of COVID and because of the way that the film industry is working now, I thought maybe I would work on a story that doesn't require a lot of actors, because it's obviously, if you've read it, there's just a couple. I mean, there's a handful of characters, but most of it takes place in a cabin with 2 characters. And I said, well, that's a pretty convenient COVID setting. So, I'll work on that. And if I get it done, I'll send it off to my agent and see what happens.
I would love to see the Men from Portlock in a movie.
Me too. I would too. That's one of, I will say this, authors, I don't know if all authors would admit it, but I think a lot of us have a favorite story or stories that we're proud of. And it's in my top group of stories I really enjoyed writing. And people really, it's a popular story. And I think part of it is, it's very straightforward. There's creepy things in it, but it's kind of relatable. It has a 3-act structure, and there's a lot of an adventure element to it. And people react to that, but I very much enjoyed writing it, because it ties into some of the more obscure stuff that I've worked on all these years. And it kind of brings that stuff to the surface a little bit.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Okay. I have a question. Why and when does horror seduce you?
Oh, and I'll rephrase it. So why do I write horror? What do I like about horror?
Oh, what do you like about horror, and why?
I think a lot of it has to do with my upbringing. When I was very young, I read a very broad spectrum of things. We had Westerns, American Westerns, romance novels, science fiction, and actually not that much horror. There was some, but the Stephen King, of course, when I was in my early teens, I started reading Stephen King, and that, of course, was interesting. But looking back on it, I think Edgar Allan Poe is to blame in some regard for why I write some of the things that I do, because it's not even that I love horror explicitly, it's that I love the macabre. And the way we were raised was so brutal at times and so rough. You would think that the inclination would be, especially when I grew up and left Alaska, that maybe I would turn to something softer, to turn away from that. It's not the way that it worked. My lifestyle and reading a lot of Edgar Allan Poe when I was a kid sort of infiltrated my subconscious, I believe. And before I started getting published, which was around 2000, 2001, I had written many, like probably close to 1 million words of fiction by hand. I had submitted maybe half a dozen stories at that time, maybe 8 or 9 stories at the very most, over about a 20-year period. I started submitting when I published my first poem when I was 10 years old. So, but my first professional sale was when I was 30, and it was a horror story. And I think the reason that happened is I had written science fiction and fantasy and historical adventure, but everything would always get dark. At some point, this darkness would creep into my writing. I didn't realize that I liked horror that much. It was the subconscious element of my personality. And so finally one day I just wrote it was my first professionally published story. and it was an homage to Lovecraft. So I wrote it kind of, imitating his style, or at least emulating it, and doing my personal spin on it, my take on it. And it was published. And I realized, I might be good at this. Maybe I should write more stories, not necessarily like that story, but more horror stories. And of course, one part I'm omitting, and I look back on this, is I used to terrify my brothers. I have two younger brothers, and we were very little. I would tell them scary stories, and they were very enraptured by them, more so than anything else that I guess I tried telling them adventure stories and fairy tales. That was all fine, but I got the best reaction from them when I would make it creepy. And so it just took me 20 years to figure out that's what I'm good at.
Hi, Laird. I am Ramon.
Hi.
I am, let me say that I am a big fan of your work. And also, I am aware of the importance of the legacy of the Gothic, the Southern Gothic, the Faulkner, William Faulkner in the works of many writers right now, including you, if I may say it. But do you think that right now it is a good time for Gothic Southern in general in America?
Pardon me. I think so. I think, I don't know about specifically the Southern Gothic, which is not my specialty. I've read Faulkner, so I do enjoy Faulkner. But I would say that my direct influence with the Gothic would be, especially contemporary, would be more like William. Well, I guess William Gay's a Southern Gothic too, but is more like some of the northern or some of the East Coast, like and the Midwest. And in the southern part of the country, I'm probably more influenced by, like, say, Cormac McCarthy, his Southwestern stuff, or Louis L'Amour's Southwestern stuff. But that said, I don't see how Gothic in general can ever not be something that is effective. It's just how it's packaged. I go back to thinking about Edgar Allan Poe, and I never used to give him credit as an inspiration. I'm always eager to credit my influences. I think that's a sign of strength, that who influences you and you credit them, as opposed to the pretense that you are sui generis and an island, which is absolutely false. We are a product of everything and everyone that we have encountered, good or bad. I'm also influenced by writers probably that I don't like, but they made some sort of an impression upon me. But in a roundabout, kind of getting this in a roundabout way, my experience is with the Gothic is that Poe had infiltrated my subconscious to a degree that I didn't even consciously recognize. I would never have slighted him. I just didn't realize until after I had written almost 3 collections. I was getting ready to publish the 3rd collection, and one day I realized just how much of my work is as macabre as it is strictly horror or cosmic horror or weird fiction, that there's this sort of Gothic element, at least informing what I do, and that a lot of the writers that I enjoy would be considered on some level, as dabbling in the macabre. So I don't know. I think that I can't say that specifically it's a good or a bad time for anything, but I just think in general, the Southern Gothic has persisted for a long time in this country, and I don't see any evidence of its influence waning.
And there is some discussion, some current animosity in some members of the community of horror readers about the legacy of Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
Lovecraft is not really Southern Gothic, but he had some of the elements of that
Sure.
current because of his admiration of Edgar Allan Poe. But what do you think about the legacy of Lovecraft? It is okay to read it without any hesitation, or we must unlearn some lectures of Lovecraft in some way?
Yes, and this is important. And I think that Lovecraft is a good example, but there are many. I mean, this is a question about the consumption of art in general, the conflation of art and artist. Where does it begin? Where does it end? What responsibility do I have as someone who is observing art or consuming art? What are my responsibilities? Obviously Lovecraft has no responsibility. He's dead. So what is it okay? And I've been asked this, I've heard this question put to many people. Is it okay to read Lovecraft? And the answer is that actually a couple of years ago, I was speaking to the Wall Street Journal about this. And I don't think I had time to really answer it, or I hadn't really thought it through. But essentially it's an extremely personal decision. So my personal opinion is, of course, it's all right. There really is. I would think that it would have to be a personal decision to say anything about it at all, whether it's good or bad. I don't know that you can honestly say that that it's not okay to read anyone. The question is what do we do with it? How do we talk about it? What facets of Lovecraft's legacy do we acknowledge, and how do we interact with them? So to me, it's not a question of is it okay to read it. It's not a question of is it okay to enjoy it. The question is how do we talk about Lovecraft, and what does his legacy mean, and what does it deserve? How does it deserve to be talked about? And so I'm a very in the United States, I'm considered a very left-leaning progressive politically. And I'm kind of in a weird situation because I was raised the opposite. I was raised by a very patriotic, and by patriotic, pro-military, pro-conservatism parent, both my parents actually. So I've seen both sides of it. As I've grown older and older, there are certain aspects that I still staunchly believe in, but in general, my politics have gone to the left, and I'm very, I would have to say, a humanist in a lot of ways. I want people to not suffer any more than necessary. I think people should be kind to each other, and I think people should be free. And so I strongly believe that the freedom to enjoy art is essential. But that doesn't mean that you can't be held account for how you disseminate. Like, in other words, Lovecraft had some views that are absolutely abhorrent. They were abhorrent then, they're abhorrent now. But I think the only sin would be to not acknowledge the good and the bad of him as a writer. And there's another aspect, when people don't want to support, like a lot of times someone in the artistic community, the art community will trespass. They will do something or say something that outrages, a lot of people. Well, and so people say, oh, I really like this author's work, but they've said these really terrible things. What do I do? Well, that's more complicated, because if you buy a living writer's work, for example, if Lovecraft were alive today, you would be directly funding, say he were anti-Semitic, you would be funding him. There's an argument to be made. Lovecraft's not around. So that strikes that off the board. People who are dead, you're not supporting their, you're definitely not directly supporting them. In a lot of cases, you're not even supporting their ancestors, who may or may not have deserved any opprobrium either. So to me, it's a nuanced thing, but it's not particularly complicated. I love a lot of Lovecraft's work. I also despise a lot of his political views.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, Laird Barron. I'm also
Hi.
a big fan of your work as a writer. My name is Alice, and my question is more about your creative process as a writer. I'm a big fan of your compelling stories and compelling characters. So my question is, when you start writing, do you have the whole idea in your mind and you start creating upon that idea, or do you develop it in the process along with your characters? Are those growing with you within the story, or how do you do it?
It's probably the same as many writers. It's a combination. Uh, and also because I've written a lot of stories, not every story was born in the same fashion. Some stories I wrote in the heat. I wrote Old Virginia, one of my first published stories. I wrote that over about a 2-week period, which for me is really quick. Generally, it takes me several months to write even a short story. I work very it's very labor intensive for me and not a lot of fun. I do a lot of rewriting, but I spend a lot of time not understanding why the story doesn't want to take shape. And so what I find is, generally speaking, it's less about writing the story. For me, the mechanical part's easy to go, oh, well, this is going to happen next. And I've written enough stories now that characters, even characters that I haven't met before, I can kind of intuit their motives pretty rapidly. I just use common sense. Well, he's a logger. I've already established that he was an orphan. Maybe he has issues. Maybe he's not, maybe he's a little cold when it comes to family issues because he doesn't, he didn't have brothers, didn't have, maybe he didn't have a lot of close family. And so I can kind of guess what's going to happen next with him in any given interaction. But the larger picture, the plot, where I want it to go, a lot of times is very organic. It will happen over the course of time. And Men from Porlock's a really good example. I wrote the first page of that. So like the first 400 words of it. I wrote that back in, I want to say 2005, 2006. And I went back to it occasionally. And I had this idea in my head. I could see the big trees and I could see the doorways. These loggers were going through the forest. And one of them had his hand on the trunk of a tree. And he's leaning against the tree and he's tired. And then he realizes that there's an outline, and that was how, it coalesces, that he realizes that it's not just bark. There's a door in the tree, and it's basically with sinew, with animal sinew. It's been stitched shut. And I had that idea, and he opened it. I had this dream, and in the dream, one of the loggers opened it, and the door is this about probably 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet wide, shoulder width, something like that. But it was vertical. It went vertically, and it went vertical probably 12 or 14 feet. And it had like the sinew hinges. It was hinged, with threaded hinges. And he's opening it. And as he opens it, I was like looking over his shoulder, and I looked up and looked way up like this. And it was a hollow tree. And there was something inside. There were shapes, and they were living. And I couldn't quite make out what they were. It was like a mass, and they began to stir. And then I woke up, and that happened a couple of times. I dreamt about that. And I was never pleased, though. When I tried to write about it, I was never satisfied with what I had dreamed, how I was translating it. And I'm sure you, with your translating work, you understand what I'm saying. Trying to get that on the paper, this image that you have, or this document that you're translating. And that's how I felt. It was very frustrating. And then I'm trying to remember when I wrote it. So about 6-7 years later is when I actually sat down and I wrote it in about 2 weeks. I just sat down and I burned through it. It's a fairly long story. It's around 16,000 words, something like that. That's a pretty decent length. And so that's an example of a story that lived with me, or I lived with it for years. Another one was The Light is the Darkness, which is a short novel that I wrote. I wrote the first 15,000 words, 20,000 words, somewhere in there, back in the early aughts, like 2003, 2004. And that was it though. That's all I had. I had plots. I could easily come up with, oh, okay, then that happens. But the right thing, for me, it has to be correct. It has to be, no, this is what it's supposed to be, not what it can be, what it's supposed to be. And about 6-7 years later, after that, I sat down, I wrote it. And once again, I wrote the second half of it in a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So even though sometimes my process is very quick and clean and I have a good idea of what's going to happen, generally that's not how it works. I have an image and then the image begins to inform what I'm like. Imago sequence, which is a very long story in that collection, that was simply a nightmare that I had. In the nightmare, I was looking at a slab of rock that had been excavated, and they were saying, look at this, there's something inside of it. There's something in there. And I won't go into the whole dream, but basically something horrible happened in the dream. And I woke up and it was about 4 or 5 in the morning. And I woke up my wife and said, oh my God, I got to tell you about this dream I had. And she says, oh God, no, why? Maybe you can wait. And it took me a couple years to write that story because nothing I wrote didn't live up to the terror of the dream, but it also wasn't what the dream was trying to tell me. Essentially, it's that whatever the muse is kept saying, no, that's incorrect, tear it up and start over again. And I would say that's more my process, unfortunately.
It's good. Thank you.
You bet.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have a question about going back to Men of Portlock. Since you had this dream, it's kind of atone with this theme you put in the story, which is the Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the person from Portlock.
Yes.
So that was pretty cool.
Thank you. He, for some reason, and it really has very little to do with all of, with his body of work. It's mostly the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but just the legends around the poet have always, interested me. And the idea of, because I dream a lot. And when I wake up, I've trained myself that if I wake up from a dream to immediately write some of it down. And so I empathize and sympathize with the idea that someone wakes up from this compelling dream and they are frantically transcribing it. And then probably someone they don't even really want to talk to, shows up and interrupts them. So I kind of thought that would be a sort of I don't want to say an Easter egg, because a lot of people don't know what that term means and they didn't understand what it meant in context of the story. But the idea of there's something important going on and then a neighbor interrupts it, I thought was sort of an amusing thing to inject into an otherwise very spooky, kind of harrowing story.
Yeah, that was right. I mean, I'm a really good... I also love a lot your work. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Nice meeting you, and thank you for today. I want to go back a little bit with this influence that you were mentioning about your childhood and how you grew up.
Sure.
And also what you mentioned about your characters being like the tendency of them being tough, and all these experiences that you have like in Alaska or in your childhood. And I just was wondering, what do you think about the argument that horror helps us with survivalism? That horror is a way through fiction for us to learn how to survive in real scenarios. And also if you see your horror stories being a help for readers to survive, I mean, survive catastrophes or survive just daily life or psychological problematics, a pandemic maybe, I don't know.
No, it's a great question. I actually almost touched on this a little bit, earlier in our conversation when we were talking about why I write horror. Well, for me, I can only speak personally, but I do know that other writers share this and some readers share this. Um, horror is actually, for me, it's kind of safe in a way that other types of fiction aren't. And I'm not talking about particularly grotesque horror. I'm talking about horror with some, that may not be all about the shock element. There may be a more of a literary element or a slow burn. It's more about character, and you care about the characters. And so if anything happens to them, then you worry. For me, it's very hard to care about characters, like say in a slasher film. I enjoy like Halloween by John Carpenter and some of those types of things, but specifically because I grew to care about the main character, Jamie Lee Curtis. Her babysitter character is eminently relatable. We all want her to be okay. We care about her. And so I kind of took that as a lesson for how to humanize what I do, is that it's more important, no matter what type of fiction you're writing. The atmosphere is important, but caring about the character can really be, or having a character that's really well developed is a big advantage. And you don't always want to do that. There are different types of things, different types of stories where that may not be important. And obviously I don't want to write one type of story. If I'm going to write 70 to 100 stories in my lifetime, I want to do different things. But characterization is important, and the humanizing element of horror. And it doesn't have to be somebody that we root for. We could be somebody that we'd like to see get bumped off. But empathy is empathy, whether empathy is positive or whether it's negative. Being able to feel what that person's feeling is a critical thing. And I find that horror is a safe way to do it compared to literary horror that is more grounded in reality. In other words, things that happen every day on the news, and then someone who is very talented makes you live through that, in excruciating, prolonged detail. To me, that's actually far more psychologically scarring than a lot of monster stories, for example, where it's not a monster, but what if? And it's the what if element. And I think that horror is really useful in some ways. I don't know if it's practical, but it's psychologically useful to run scenarios. That's one thing I learned during childhood, is that human beings love nothing more than to go, what if? And it could be, what if the moon, landings were fake? Or it could be, what if we're going to go land on the moon? What do you think we'll find? It could be, what if we woke up tomorrow and the pandemic intensified? This was just the first stage. What if tomorrow it gets worse? So what if could be anything. And we like to ask ourselves that. Horror is very basic. It's very primal. And so we get to address in kind of a systematic way, we get to address, well, what would happen if this, then this, then this, and explore our reactions to it. In a lot of ways, I think it's why video games are becoming more and more popular, especially the story-driven video games, the ones that are almost as much as a visual novel as they are pressing buttons. Because the reason that it's reaching the mainstream now, as opposed to like when I was coming up on video games, where it was very, very few people, it was very segregated. Only some people really liked video games. Everybody else laughed. Well, these video games, especially the scary ones, are allowing people who aren't really into the hand-eye coordination stuff, the reflex stuff, to get into, yeah, that was me. If I was in that rundown hospital, what would I do? So in a lot of ways, I think writing was like that long before, especially short fiction. What would you do if you were stuck in a grave? If you woke up and you were in a grave? What would you do if you killed somebody? How would you hide it? Edgar Allan Poe can tell you this. He'll describe it. There may be a consequence. As far as the practical application, I don't, other people, I think Stephen Graham Jones has talked about this. John Langan has talked about this. I think it's a bigger picture than what horror specifically does. I think that literature in general, and probably art in general, like if you're going to talk about film too, can prepare us. I don't know if it can necessarily prepare us unless you have some sort of specific fact in a story that someone in a desperate situation remembers and says, I remember reading in a Laird Barron story once that if you ever fall through the ice in the middle of the winter and you're soaking wet, crawl out and get into a snowbank and roll, because the snow will absorb a lot of that water and will actually dry you off. And then you'll smash the snow will freeze because it's got all the water in it, and you smash it off. It'll be like a shell, and you whack it off your body, and you're essentially dry compared to what you were. There's a fact that you could use in a story. But I think in general, the use of art, it's more, I see people talk about Thomas Ligotti, his work this way, in a way that you don't hear a lot of people talk about other writers. He understood me. He understands what I'm thinking. And that's why melodramatic poetry and music are so popular. Lovelorn kids going, nobody knows what it's like to be horny like I do. And then somebody sings a song about being horny and they're like, oh, wow, I guess I'm not the first one. In a lot of ways, I'm not alone. So I do think that horror, because it is specific, does appeal to a certain group of people that might be othered, so to speak. And they read Ligotti, who talks about very private and very painful psychological states, and his readership identifies with him in a way that I don't see with other writers, not to that degree.
Laird, we have I'm sorry, Gabby. Sorry, guys. Laird, we have a question. Good that you're talking about Ligotti. Last night, I actually have a pending duel with Ernesto. We're gonna choose swords, 2 meters. We were talking about the second story that we discussed last night from yours was the carrion gods in their heaven. Mm-hmm. First of all, Isidro, he's watching from the live. He wants to know if Miranda, did she die? Or you're not gonna tell us?
I really, sometimes privately when someone emails me, I will tell them, but in general, I don't. I just think I think it robs the, like, I know what happened to her. Trust me. Or if I don't know, I will. It's pretty obvious. I'll say, look, it could be anything, but yeah, I'm not gonna say. But it's not really a big deal. I mean, it really isn't a big deal. I mean, at the end, you certainly get the impression that she's alive in some form, right? So, I do believe, and I don't mean to be glib or coy, but I do think, to some degree, that what I think is less important than what the reader thinks, because one element in a lot of my stories, obviously not all of them, sometimes sometimes it could just be that I didn't write something clearly enough, and I think that that's a legitimate situation. Like, wait a minute, I don't understand. In the middle of the story, something happened with this character. Did you mean for me to not understand, or did you make a mistake? And I've made mistakes. Generally speaking, though, especially with the weird endings, I'm a firm believer in the Schrodinger's cat theory, that basically, or that the idea of quantum physics, that there's basically competing states of reality. So I actually love it that I have a pretty clear idea of every single story, how they end and what it means. But I actually delight in the fact that someone will come along and go, well, I think something different. I think this is what happened. And the reason that I feel this way is nothing disappoints me more than loving a song like Hotel California by the Eagles. I don't want to hear Don Henley saying, oh, it meant nothing, because he has said that more than once. Glenn Frey, it meant nothing. I'm like, shut up. It's about Satan. It's about this guy died while he's driving down the highway. He's in purgatory. I don't care what you think. This is what it is. And I respect my readers, and I don't, if someone really appeals to me privately, sometimes I'll tell them what my interpretation is. But in general, I do not like to publicly, because everybody else that doesn't agree with what I'm going to say is going to be disappointed.
Correct. One thing that really pissed me off last night was the fact that some people were saying that Brucifer was not the villain of the, he was the real, he was the bad guy. These girls, none of them were bad.
That's not true. We were saying it was a very complex character, not that he wasn't the bad guy, okay?
We will discuss that story for ages, and we will go back to it. Another question that Isidro has right here, it's, well, it has to do, we discussed it too, the more dark. We can count around 25 to 30 real life characters in that movie, because I felt it like a movie, that's why I'm saying. In that story, some of your descriptions are positive, yes. Some are not that very positive.
That's right.
We've read it many times on, even Mr. S.T. Yoshi, he didn't have the kindest words for that for that story. And we respect him a lot, yeah. He's a great critic. But some people like it last night. Some people didn't like this story. The constant was like, this is a local joke. Probably him and Mr. John Langan or Paul Tremblay, they read it and they had a laugh, like, like the joke. This is a joke. What was the reaction? And were you happy with this?
Ecstatic. It's a controversial story. It was intended to be what it is. It was intended to be incendiary. Now, one thing I will say is I don't want people, especially, living people, to be offended that weren't intended to be offended. That, of course, would make me, I wouldn't change it, but I would apologize if someone that I wasn't intending to insult felt insulted. The people that I did insult, I'm glad they're insulted. There's a lot of things going on with this story. One, where I was at the time in my life. Also, there's sort of a tradition. I feel like it's an unspoken tradition to write a story like this, especially if you have a career, if you do more than a few stories. I've been around for 20 years. At the time, it was about a dozen. But you're kind of, I won't say expected, but there is a tradition of, especially in horror, Carl Edward Wagner, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but a really great story that he wrote about a couple authors, and one becomes successful and the other one never really becomes successful. And it's a vampire or a vampirism story, but it's about him and a friend. There's no other way to interpret it. So you're at some point, I think I almost feel, compelled to write a story about people that I know. And it's also, it's not even just about the people that I knew at the time or know now, but it's also about the industry. It's about fandom, and it's about the cult of personality. I will say this, because I would direct people to the Ligotti website, Thomas Ligotti Online or Ligotti Online. You can find it somewhere. You'd have to probably do a word search, but I did a pretty lengthy interview with John Paget, who is, by the way, a really great writer. If you guys have not read him, you should read Paget. Super good writer. And he is the curator of a lot of Ligotti's. I don't think is a curator of his papers and stuff, but he does seem to basically do a lot of work for Ligotti, publicity, and he obviously has this site. And so we did a pretty thorough interview because they were furious. I don't know if he was furious. He was kind of mad. But there are people to this day that are quite furious about that story because of Ligotti's depiction in the story, or alleged depiction. I've never said who L is. If you want to say it's Ligotti, that's great. But the bottom line is, I did say in the interview, any of the acid, any of the satire is not directed at Ligotti. I strongly disagree with Ligotti on life philosophy. It's funny because we actually run parallel tracks. But I'm not a nihilist. I believe in going down swinging. And he's kind of, I think what life's worth living, whether I live for another 5 minutes or whether I live for another 40, 50 years. To me, the you know, it was better to have loved than to have not loved at all, loved and lost, not loved at all. And Legati is, you know, and not to do him any disservice, but essentially life is an abomination and we're all screwed. And I agree with him that it can be and that we are, but I certainly don't share the idea that it's not worth it. And so we really disagree. But that said, my barbs were directed at the cult of fandom, not at the fans in general, but at just the, you know, sort of the deification of someone, and also that kind of philosophy that life isn't worth anything. And so yeah, I wrote a story in very strong reaction. And as I told John Paget, I don't know if I told him this publicly, but I'll tell you, I suffer from clinical depression. I have extreme depression at times, and it never goes away. It's just that sometimes I'm more functional than others, and it's a struggle. Even at my best, I told him, I said, I'm going through life struggling to stay here. I'm not really interested in entertaining, especially, you know, in a deifying way, or in venerating a philosophy of we should all just, you know, have never been here in the first place. And to be honest and to be fair, it doesn't matter whether he's right or not. I'm struggling with what I'm struggling with, and so I reject that philosophy like it's poison. And so that informed the story. But it's not about Thomas Legati, because Legati is, you know, as he has publicly said, is struggling with very severe psychological and maybe chemical conditions, you know, that are beyond his control. And I think, you know, he has shown courage and toughness, and, you know, talking about it, and he's still here with us. And, you know, I salute him in that. But I don't appreciate the people who kind of make it almost like a philosophy that should be venerated. I just, you know, and I'm not saying I'm right. I'm fully aware that I might be too close to this subject, but I feel how I feel, and I wrote the story that I wrote, and it wasn't about Legati. Legati, actually, if you read the story closely, this Thomas L. character is correct in the context of the story. What the creature is saying turns out to be true, and the author, which is, you know, loosely based on myself, is wrong. So that was intentionally done, not as sarcasm, but for me to acknowledge that I feel how I feel, but I could be completely wrong about this. And that's fine. It's not going to change my mind unless, you know, we will never know what the real answer is. But a lot of people were very angry about it. And I took some shots at people who have done, in my mind, some very terrible things in the industry. And it is what it is. And, you know, I regret nothing, as they say.
Awesome answer. Well, I have a question from a friend who's here, Jaime. He asked, do you remember the origin of your story, Andy Kaufman creeping through the trees?
Yes. Andy Kaufman frightened me when I was a kid. And I'm sure you guys are aware of Mike Davis, the Lovecraft e-zine. I was being interviewed by him recently, and we actually were talking about things that scare us. And, you know, when I was a kid, I was not a typical suburban kid. I had a glass eye and was bullied a lot. And so my dad taught me to box when I was 5 years old to defend myself. And I'm glad he did, because I had to defend myself. And then later on, we moved, you know, when I was about 8 or so, we moved into the wilderness. And I had pneumonia. I had frostbite on my hand. I mean, all kinds of things. We were hungry. I was fairly tough. Like I said, I wasn't a tough guy, but I wasn't like a typical kid. There, you know, I didn't whine or complain about stuff that I would have if I'd been raised in the suburbs. So, you know, a soft lifestyle where kids are like, oh, I don't want to take out the garbage. Oh, do I have to, you know, feed the dog? No, I'm out when I'm 10 years old. I'm out, you know, feeding 40 dogs, chopping holes in the ice, you name it, like a grown man, essentially. So things that scared me, I look back and go, that, you know, was unusual. I was scared about things like being eaten by a bear or falling through the ice, or maybe my father, who was not all there, might decide that he had one too many kids. He talked about that every now and then. I was worried about very explicit, very present kinds of problems. I was concerned about the here and the now, not about the hypothetical. But Andy Kaufman frightened me, and the way that came about is that we didn't have electricity, but we still were able to watch a few hours of television on a black and white screen every week. And the way we did it is my father took a car battery, you know, out of a car, and we had a little generator, the kind you pull the crank and it runs for a couple hours, and he would charge the battery, and then we would just attach the TV to it. And we were about 50, 60 miles from civilization. So you'd run the little antenna up, and we got some of the stations. And one of the, but we couldn't pick. You know, essentially, if the weather was bad, you wouldn't get these 3 stations, but you might be able to kind of see this one. And so one show that always came in because of the atmosphere was late at night, and it was a show called Taxi. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it was a big comedy back in the 80s. It might even start in the late 70s, but it was in the early 80s in the US. And Andy Kaufman played a mechanic on the show. And he was all very like, you know, and he was like, hello, you know, I talk like this. And he was all very moon-faced. They accentuated his face, and he was harmless, right? That was even his stand-up comedy affect, is that he's sort of harmless. He would get up there and go, why are you laughing? You know what, though? Kids are not fooled. You cannot fool a child. And when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, I looked into his beady, glittering eyes, and I said, he's thinking about killing everybody he's looking at. That's what I thought. He's thinking about killing every single person in that studio audience. And that's why he's kind of a little smile as their heads are coming off. That's what I honestly thought when I was a kid. Maybe not that explicitly, but I'm like, he's a bad man. There's something wrong with him. Now, I don't think that's true. I'm sure Andy Kaufman was a great guy, but he was fake. He was pretending, and he was faking it. He was faking civility and kindness and warmth. And those are things that when you fake them, that raises the hackles on the neck of somebody who knows that it's a trick. And so for years, I just sort of in the back of my mind, I didn't know what I was going to do with him. But I wrote a story a few years ago called Termination Dust. And one of the characters hallucinates a ghostly Michael Jackson type figure. I never say Michael Jackson, but that's who I'm alluding to. And I got that from, there was a movie called True Romance years ago, and the main character keeps seeing, you never see his face, but you see Elvis. He hallucinates Elvis when he's stressed. And so I thought, that's an interesting idea, but what if the hallucination is actually real in some way? Like it has like some tangible substance that it can, like a ghost, essentially, that you're not so much hallucinating, that you are manifesting something that, and what if it's even creepier? It's not Clarence in True Romance isn't seeing Elvis. He's seeing his version of Elvis. And I'm like, I'll take that a step further. What if my characters are seeing something that's pretending to be Michael Jackson? And so because I'd written that story, but hadn't gone any further with it, I basically came up with this idea that we are haunted by, and I'm not going to say what I think they are, but essentially we are living with phantoms that take the form of, generally speaking, dead personalities. There's a line in the story where I talk about, for our generation or for the generation in this story, it was Andy Kaufman that they would see as a ghost or as a hallucination or a ghost or whatever. But that previous generations, it might be, if you go far back, it could be Benjamin Franklin stalking someone, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be anything to do with TV. It's just people who were famous at one time or another, a generation or two after they're dead, these phantoms will adopt their characteristics for whatever reason. And that's how I came up with that. And of course, it's even more complex because Andy Kaufman had the running joke of various characters who everybody knew was him, but he go, oh no, they're real people. And so that was also the thing that was running through the story, is it was a person pretending to be a person, maybe pretending to be another person. And I don't know, I had fun. I feel like you've got to do something like that every now and then.
Well, and he was really scary too. I mean, looking back when I was a kid and I saw him, I was like, who's this? Are you familiar with the Ayuwoki?
What's that?
Ayuwoki? No?
No.
This is a Mexican thing. I mean, you know, Ayuwoki, they took Michael Jackson and they deformed it when he's white, like white Michael Jackson after he died. And they made it like looking like an anime, like a manga thing, but it's a monster. And they call it Ayuwoki because we Mexicans, you know, we have an accent, and it's "Are you okay?" So they came up with the name Ayuwoki. So it's a Mexican Michael Jackson monster, similar to what you're saying.
Wow, I did not know that.
And it's very scary. I will send you the link. Well, we are running short on time. I want to ask Liz Hinojosa. She was watching too. She's watching. She wants to know what is, from all the books or the stories you've written, what is your favorite? And in this question, we can put Jose Talamante's question. Would you like to see any of your work adapted to another media, not only movies, maybe to comics, to graphic novel?
Oh, I would love it. I love graphic novels. Obviously, Phil Gillette adapted a story of mine for it was called 30, but the movie's called They Remain, and he did a very faithful job. And so that was a thrill, and I would love to see more of my stuff. Obviously, financially, it would be helpful, but also I think, especially a TV series, I would love it if someone would adapt my crime novels into they're basically devolved into horror crime or supernaturally inflected stuff. I would love to see that stuff come out on Netflix or HBO, because even more so than a movie, because I really think some of the best work being done is being done on a serial basis. The Westworld, I've seen the first 3 seasons of it. Oh, it's just fantastic. Because they have time to develop it. And so, yes, I would love to see that. Now, if I'm getting the earlier part of the question correct, what is my personal favorite story? There's 2 answers to that. There's my favorite and the one that I think is the best job that I've done, that I'm proudest of. The story that I'm the proudest of, it's not a popular story at all. It's called Parallax, and it's in the first collection Imago sequence. And it's about, for people who don't know, it's basically about an artist, an eccentric artist, maybe they all are, extremely successful eccentric artist whose wife has disappeared. And we're following him because her disappearance is extremely mysterious, and he has been tried. Essentially people are worried that maybe he murdered her or caused her to disappear. I think that was the best story. And it took me almost a year to write that story. Now granted, I had a day job, but I worked for many, many months on that story. It took me a long time. And the way that it fits together, the things that I was able to do in it, they're things that you won't necessarily notice unless you read my other stuff and you read it again. So it was for me, that the intricacy of it. My favorite story, the story that I enjoyed writing, obviously The Men from Porlock would be one of them. But I wrote a story called LD50 a few years ago. I actually published it on my blog, and then I put it in Swift to Chase. And it's about it was about my first recurring character, serial, like POV, point of view character, Jessica Mace. And it was about her somewhere in Eastern Washington State investigating someone who had been somebody was killing dogs, like serial killer of pets, which is actually a true story. It didn't take place in Washington State, but it took place in that region. And someone at about that time period, I read about it in the paper, had killed dozens, if not hundreds, they think possibly hundreds of people's pets. And that bothered me. Like it really affected me. So I wrote a story about her. She's hitchhiking across the U.S. and getting into trouble. And people who recognize that name know that she comes from the story I mentioned earlier, Termination Dust, the one with the guy hallucinating Michael Jackson. That's a huge cast of characters, and Jessica Mace was one of the main characters in it, and she survived having her throat cut. And after that, I started writing stories about her, and I plan to write many more. But I really do think that first standalone story that I did about her may be my favorite.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mariana again. I have two questions. The first one is, what are your favorite poetry titles? And the second one, I don't know if I can express it well, but I will try. In two tales or in various tales, I mean, you even have this title of all lit. So I wanted to know about some symbiotic characters. I mean, what I enjoyed about, for example, Broadsword, Hodel, or the Gods, the tale we read yesterday, is that the main characters are like kind of running away from something, but at the same time they get like some symbiosis, or they are kind of symbiotic with the evil outside, but it's like they are engaged in this evilness, but they accept something like them being free about it. I mean, like an acceptance about our own beast instincts or primal instincts that you mentioned before. And well, for me, that's very enjoyable. I think that it's the difference from Ligotti. I mean, it is like looking to the abyss, but you are not into it. I mean, I don't know how to express it, but how about it?
Okay, that's great. The first part, poetry, I like a lot of poetry. I wrote poetry and published poetry. I don't get to do that much anymore because I just am so consumed and busy writing fiction. But I grew up reading very basic poetry, like Robert Service. People can look him up if they aren't familiar. That's very basic poetry. But when I became, I kind of got into it when I was older in my 20s. I really started reading a lot more poetry. And I'll just mention two of my very favorite poets are Charles Simic. And I would recommend, in both of these cases, they have dozens of small books of poetry that may be hard to get. I would say get his collected works, because it'll give you a selection of it. And that's pretty much what, I mean, I have a bunch of his stuff. I could dig it up on the shelf back there. I actually have a stack of it. When I was on tour, I bought one bookstore. I bought everything they had, but I find that I get the most enjoyment just from the big collected works. Charles Simic, there's this just beautiful melancholy to his work. He grew up during wartime, and he saw a lot of terrible things, and he writes beautifully. I mean, poets are not all beautiful in the same way, and he just is truly a beautiful writer, probably a beautiful person, I suspect. And Mark Strand, similarly. And it's funny, is Mark Strand is also another very humane, which I would say applies to Simic. They're very humane. Even when they're writing about dark, brutal subject matter, there's this depth of tenderness to their writing that they're not glorying in it. They're not trying to shock you or titillate you. There's tears in their eyes, and they're like, "This is what I saw. What do you think? You know, what are we doing? What have we done? What are we going to do?" So those are two. Mark Strand, collected works. I get tears in my eyes thinking about those two guys. I think that they interact in a way with the world that more prose authors, novelists, would do well to look at and to maybe try to emulate a little bit. I have tried. But it's very difficult. Poetry is for me, poetry is the supreme written form. Almost impossible. I would never be able to be anything other than maybe a good poet, a journeyman poet. As far as the abyss, I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but I think I get the larger, context. I talk about how what we see, especially these extreme things that characters witness, how they interact with it and how it changes them. And some of my characters, probably most of them, it's going to consume them or deform them further than they already are. They're usually broken in the first place. That's why they're intersecting. That's why they're in a position to be encountering this marginal. They're somewhat marginalized, either psychologically, socially, in some way. They're marginalized and they're, cut off from the herd, so to speak. They're not as safe, and they may be self-destructive. What I picture with most of my characters who basically kind of succumb to it they kind of go down fighting or they kind of accept it. If you've ever seen, there's a photograph of a fox, and the fox is carrying a bird, probably a grouse. The bird's not dead. The bird is just, and the bird has accepted its fate. It will, at the slightest opportunity, if that fox drops it, will fly off or run off, whatever it can do. Or if the fox doesn't, it will be eaten. It's just simply living in that moment, and it has accepted. It hasn't accepted like, oh, good, I'm dying. It's more just like, well, I'm probably going to die now, but I'll keep waiting and watching. Maybe I can make a break for it. That informs a lot of how I look at life and how a lot of my characters do. The other part of it, though, the symbiotic, because I thought you said something about symbiosis. There is a symbiotic relationship, especially with the villains, with the darkness, and there are people who embrace the darkness. They don't accept it. They see it as, well, how can I manipulate it? Or how can I allow it to, they won't necessarily say they won't necessarily acknowledge corruption, but they are basically saying, yeah, corrupt me. You see it with politicians, right? Some politicians are quite happy to accept the money. They're quite happy to do whatever they need to do to stay in power. And they like to inflict their power on others. They would probably never say, oh, I'm corrupt. They would just simply say, I've accepted the way things are, and I'm going to, who am I to stand in the way? I'm going to use this to my advantage. And that is something that's also going on. But that's the villains. The larger group are people who are caught. They find themselves caught. And in a lot of melodrama, people freak out. Like you see a lot of shows, it's the cliche, crying, screaming, pulling their hair out, acting frantic. That's in my experience, I've been around a lot of bad things. Yes, that is a stage, like there's stages of grief, but generally what people do is they deny, or they just sort of learn to live with it. It's the double-edged sword with human beings. We are adaptable. That's good and it's bad. It's good because we're always ready to survive. The bad part is we'll accept almost any indignity, either imposed upon us or upon our neighbors. We're seeing that in our politics. We accept almost anything if we feel like we don't have a choice. And I think that my characters, through, they're simple, they're characterizations. They're not real people. But I do think that's what they're reflecting more often than not.
Thank you a lot for the clarity.
Well, I have another question. I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about other writers admiring you and having this anthology, Children of a Leech, based on your universe?
I didn't want them to do the anthology. Ross Lockhart came to me and said he wanted to do it. I was flattered. And especially when I saw so many of the people that were doing it, I didn't know the whole list, but I saw, I'm like, oh my goodness. I thought it was too soon. If it was even worthy of doing it in the first place. I mean, that's another, but let's just say, okay, they're going to do it. But I'm like, well, let's wait another 5-10 years. That's that kind of thing. So I was very uncomfortable with it, but they were insistent, and I was like, do as you will, I guess. I'm extremely flattered. I'm really flattered because if you read those stories and you're familiar with my work, they all did their own, they completely did their own thing with the stories. There's no, it's even more so than like a lot of times people will do with Lovecraft. There was just this huge variety. And that really flattered me. The ones that were the least like my own work, I think John Langan did one of the stories that was the closest to mine. And even that, only John could have written that story, but there were many stories in there that I never would have written a story like that. But I could see what I saw is, oh, you read my stuff and it got you thinking about something and you wrote your story. And so when someone, if an author, and I have been honored occasionally to have an author say, I really like Laird Barron, or I respect him or his work. It means a lot to me because I got through my childhood with the help of authors that I loved. It goes back to that question you asked me earlier about, can someone take something practical from your writing and use it in their life? I actually did feel like I got some really good life lessons from Roger Zelazny, who, for anybody who doesn't know, wrote Lord of Light. He's a science fiction author in the 60s through the 90s. He died in the mid 90s. He wrote the Amber Chronicles, the 9 Princes of, and so he wrote science fiction, fantasy, a little bit of horror, but his characters, no matter how powerful, because a lot of times he would write about very powerful characters, like the lead character of 9 Prince of Amber is a prince, and he's superhuman. He is like, we're all shadows. Our world is a shadow of his world where he comes from, and he's basically Superman compared to us. He gets his ass handed to him frequently throughout that series. He gets things wrong. He is defeated time and again. He is tricked time and again. He is constantly recriminating himself for what a jerk he was in the years prior to the story starting. He says, I'm embarrassed about my things that I've done in the past. And I got to tell you, as a 10, 12-year-old kid with a glass eye who dealt with a lot of physical adversity when I was in town with other kids who were not very nice. Sometimes I won, sometimes I did not. When I raced sled dogs, sometimes we won, sometimes more often than not, we did not. What I got from Zelazny was it's okay. It's okay to lose. You do your best. You fight. That's all you can do. And no one has any right to expect anything else from you. And you certainly should not damn yourself because you're not perfect. And I got that from Roger Zelazny. And it wasn't even something he explicitly said. It's something that his characters demonstrated. So that was hugely important to me.
Thank you very much. It's a very nice thought too. I think we're gonna close the transmission live. Maybe you have a few words for the people who's watching live before we disconnect them. We're gonna stay a couple of minutes after, but for the people on the Facebook transmission, it was a nice thought this last from Roger Zelazny. But some words of wisdom from Laird Barron himself.
I don't have any words of wisdom. I just have words of encouragement. I think about a lot of people all over the world struggling right now. And we've always been struggling. People have always had a hard time. I think the coronavirus if there's anything good about it, it has united some of us to understand that we're not, alone with our problems, and that, we're all just people. And my very best goes out to everybody out there watching this, and to any of you who are writers specifically. It could go for anything else in your life, but if you're a writer, I said this in a recent interview, you're going to have adversity. You're not always going to win. It's okay. As long as you're doing what you want to do and you're being faithful to that, you're doing what you need to do. You don't have to always be perfect. You don't have to always win. And I think our culture here, I was just speaking about the United States, this whole idea of winning, and we see it in our politics, is wrong. Winning, competition is wonderful, but trying to win at all costs is a very debased value. You know, it's okay to be an artist just to be an artist. And that would be as close to the words of wisdom that I have. But thank you all for out there for tuning in, and thank you for caring.